Oh, hi, hello, and welcome. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby. And I am your host, she who is feeling very conflicted about the Thesmophoria Zeusai, Liv. So, you all heard this week's narrative episode. You know how I feel. But man, that play, I don't know what to do with it. And frankly, it's only going to get more absurd. Oh, there's some redeeming qualities, thankfully. Fucking Aristophanes, you know? Who the fuck did he think he was? Anyway, fortunately for my own excessive emotions and inability to talk about that play objectively, I had the opportunity to speak to not one, but two very smart academics about Aristophanes and this play specifically, those women at the Thesmophoria. And thank the gods for both of these conversations, because they will absolutely not only redeem the play, but just redeem my inability to tell the play in any kind of coherent and enjoyable way. Today I spoke with past guest of the podcast, Julie Levy, who very kindly volunteered to speak with me about this nonsense play when I tweeted about it. Julie last joined me on the show to talk about asexuality in Greek mythology. Very different topic, but even more fascinating because it's not Aristophanes. Highly recommend that last episode with Julie. But today we did talk about Aristophanes, and I am so glad we did, because as much as I am officially not a fan, talking to Julie about the context and history and Aristophanes himself added so much to this play, and next week's conversation is only going to make it better. Honestly, just so much better. My series would have been straight up obnoxious without the addition of this kinds of context. So we talked about history and the man himself and how all of that weaves its way into this play and makes it far more interesting and even, if you can believe it, more tolerable. I'm sorry, I'm being so unkind to this play, but frankly, I'm only human, and if this show is anything, it is not objective when it comes to the mistreatment of women and, of course, the slander of my beloved Euripides. And so, yeah, we talked a lot about that, too, because Julie and I are both enormous Euripides fans who made certain to defend him from all of that Aristophanic slander. He did not deserve this nonsense play being served to him, nor did the women of ancient Athens. But again, I'm letting my emotions take hold. So let's just listen to a much more reasonable scholar who knows enough about history and context to provide much needed insights into this absolutely wild and absurd play. Conversations in defense of Euripides. Why is Aristophanes the way that he is? With Julie Levy. I want to prep the listener for where I personally am at with this play, which is that I have written 2 episodes about it. There will be 3. And then I just speed read the end of the play so that I had it all in my head to talk to you. But like, so I was quoting the Theodoretus translation for the podcast, but I've also been reading the Halliwell because I have a copy of the book and it's been helpful with like endnotes and things. And teaching me, not teaching me, but reminding me of how some translations go, which is that I really enjoyed the Theodoretus at the beginning because it is much more fun, like in colloquial language. And then we start getting a lot of use of the words like slut and whore that are not in the other translation, and thus I imagine are a bit of a stretch even from the Greek, which I didn't have a chance to look at.
Oh, actually, but in this case, it might go the other direction.
Really? Okay. Great, I want to hear about that because
I would have to check because I haven't looked at the Greek in years. But like I said, I just reread the Theodoretus because I wanted it to be an enjoyable read. I'm not here writing a paper about it.
Yeah,
but
it is a much more fun translation for the most part.
Yeah, Euripides does a really good job with the poetry and translation site of making really accessible versions of this stuff. I'm really impressed generally, but it does tend towards the colloquial and the updated. But in Aristophanes, in particular, there's a tendency for there to be a lot of really crude and callous jokes. I mean, really, all the comedians do this. I shouldn't say it's just Aristophanes. It's just I can tolerate Aristophanes better than I can tolerate Menander, which is just me.
Valid. I've never read any Menander, and I've only read, this is my third Aristophanes, and I remain unimpressed. So
you picked a doozy. The one I like best is the frogs.
Yeah, I agree.
The frogs is my favorite.
I mean, the frogs is so fun. I think that's the problem too. So I've read Lysistrata and the frogs, and now Thesmophoria Zeusai, and the frogs is so fun. Like, it's just so silly and great, and we have singing frogs, and like Aristophanes or Euripides rather being silly in the underworld, and I love it. And then like Lysistrata 2, I need to reread it because I read it like it was a while ago for the podcast, and it was before I had like kind of a better grasp on things, and I have a feeling like I would read it very differently now. So I didn't want to use that as like an example, but like, yeah, the comparison between frogs and this is like, what's happening? Like, why?
Yeah. The other one I would recommend is The Birds. The Birds is also pretty fun. More in line with the frogs than with Thesmophoria Zeusai. This is just such a strange play.
It is so weird.
And it's got such a strange setting, and I think that's very deliberate. There's one thing people don't realize about Aristophanes is that that Aristo at the beginning of his name is not for show. He was a very elitist sort of person, and he really did not like anything that pandered to anyone below his supposed station.
He seems
and
fun.
We like to think of ancient Athens, especially around this time, as like a haven of free and equal democracy with no social stratification, but that's kind of nonsense. There was a constant tension between the noblemen, the upper class, in terms of wealth, in terms of power, in terms of holdings, and everyone else. And a lot of the people that we hear the most from, like Aristophanes, like Thucydides, are going to be people in that class. And so Aristophanes is not, he's not Terence, the comic play writer from Rome, who was a former slave who was freed over the quality of his writing. He's not that. He's coming at this from the perspective of looking down. And so when he does political satire, which is the main thing that Aristophanes does, it's not always going to be easy to reconcile that with how we think about things. Because he was an oligarch.
Yeah.
Well,
that's interesting context that I wasn't fully aware of. I've been reading some sources on him, but they've all kind of tended towards just like his writing style and like kind of all of that. And there's only, so many sources I can read when I'm doing weekly episodes, but it so many outside sources, I should say. The primary are great, and then trying to learn about the other people, I'm like, whew. But also, I mean, I just, it's funny because I came into covering this play because all I had really heard about it, is that it features this women's festival and that it features Euripides slander. That like I have had, I would say, I'm trying to remember when this happened, but I know it has, like, at least once or twice I have made my varied defenses of Euripides as I mean, both like the best, but I guess that we can't all agree that he's the best. But I think that there's a really strong argument to be made that he was the most interested in women's voices and women's characters, and I fucking love him for that. And so, like, what I've been told about Thesmophoria Zeusai was that it is somehow like a reasonable source for the idea that Euripides actually hated women. Like, people have like used that as
that's funny.
as a source. And now in hindsight, I'm like, that's absolute fucking nonsense. Not least because this is fiction, and Aristophanes is like poking fun at so many things. But also, like, I mean, now I've read it, I'm like, well, I mean, they don't even believe it. Like, when they're making the arguments, these characters, like, it's not actually really based much in Euripides' like actual, writing and characters. It's all this like over the top stereotypical, takes on everything. But that's what I came into this play as. And now I'm like, oh my God. Like, I think the thing I really want to talk about most is the way he's playing with and poking fun at gender, because as like one person telling this story in 2023, I'm just like, oh my God, how do I do this? Like,
and there's so much to unpack with this one, because not only is it Aristophanes looking down on Euripides, whom he clearly did not like for a number of reasons, not least because he did explore women's voices in a sympathetic light. Like, all of the arguments you get in Thesmophoria Zeusai are basically Aristophanes saying, but women are terrible, and you're revealing all of their secrets.
Yeah. And it's
such a right-wing argument. It's like, it reminds me so much of, like, when you listen to these, I mean, I'm American, so forgive me, but these Republican politicians talking about abortion, and, they start going off on, like, personal responsibility, and, like, all of these misconceptions about how women will just use an abortion instead of birth control, and it's like, wow, you've never met a woman in your life, have you? Like, it really has that feel to me of, like, Aristophanes was pushing that, that agenda of, like, well, of course women are terrible, and you writing them as sympathetic is going to make them hate you. And that's how I have come away from it. But I think it's really fascinating, this, like, how Aristophanes views women versus how he views Euripides viewing women, which is so complicated. But also just, like, because the stereotypes are so very different. But one of the things that's really different between like, white Western culture and like ancient Athens is that in ancient Athens, the idea was that women were shamelessly addicted to sex, and that men were the ones who were, like, restrained. And now the idea that would be the stereotype seems wild, because the idea is that women are frigid and men are always, like, having to debase themselves to get sex. And, like, all of those stereotypes are obviously bunk, both directions, but you can see it in how Aristophanes writes his women, both in this and in the Lysistrata particularly, which were almost certainly performed the same year, by the way.
Yeah, that's interesting. That was one of the things that I was fascinated by.
Yeah. So, like, the context of Aristophanes putting out these two plays where the women are in charge and the men are, behaving like women, to his mind. The context for this, like, this is the year 411 BCE. This is the year, like, they're in the Peloponnesian War, and things have been going kind of badly because they made some really ridiculous mistakes. And later in the year than this festival, I'm pretty sure, some historian's going to come in and like correct me on the exact chronology here, but this is the same year that we get the overthrow of the democracy and a Persian-influenced oligarchic government gets installed to try and finish the war.
Yeah, it's quite a time. Like, I mean, politically, and then also in like the relevancy of what, you know, like the overarching themes of this play, because even just you saying the year, I think that's also, I mean, and it's pretty evident from the text itself too, but I think it's 1 year after the Helen and the Andromeda were performed by Euripides.
And both of those are cited in this play.
Exactly. So they're made very relevant, but it also kind of feels like this is written in reaction to that, because the other thing that I am like obsessed with when it comes to Euripides broadly, but I believe it's the Helen that's the catalyst, at least in my head, but like certainly the year is the change, is that after that point, Euripides doesn't write choruses that aren't women. And I fucking love that. So I feel like, I mean, it's like obviously
I hadn't put that together, but that's wonderful.
Yes, it's my favorite thing in the whole world. Like he hits this line and he's like, I am now disinterested in choruses of men. And I could talk about Euripides for the rest of my life, I think.
He's wonderful. I'm right there with you. He's my favorite of the tragedians too.
He's just he's magnificent.
And a lot of it is for how he writes women. Yeah. So there are 2 women in particular over the course of 3 plays that are cited as the reasons why the women hate Euripides.
Mm-hmm. Phaedra. They really hate Phaedra.
Phaedra and Melanippe. And unfortunately, we don't have either of the Melanippe plays. We have some fragments. When you look at Phaedra, she's such a sympathetic character, even though she's driven by this terrible situation and her terrible feelings. Like, you can feel empathy for her in what she's doing. Mm-hmm. And it's clearly within the play, it's like, well, yeah, she's like way closer in age to Hippolytus than to his father, so of course, right?
And also his father is Theseus. Let's be frank. Let's make sure that the listener recalls this, because I have not covered the Hippolytus. I want to, but I have not. So just
can I come back for that?
Please, yeah. Well, did you know? And I want to share. I'll share this on mic too, but I was going to anyway. And I think he tweeted about it. But I just recently hung out with Jeremy Swiss because he was visiting Victoria, and he reminded me or mentioned to me that he is using our episode where you did already come onto my show to talk at least Hippolytus in terms of like sexuality, and he's using that for his class, that everyone has to listen to that after they read Hippolytus. And so yes, absolutely, you can come back, but I'm like, we've already kind of done that too, and I always forget because I haven't covered Hippolytus, but you've come on to talk about it in that context, and I was like, oh right, I have that content. That's great. I'm so glad people are all liking it.
I can talk about the Hippolytus for like an entire class.
Well, I will make a note to make sure you come back when I cover the full play.
And shout out to Jeremy and his wonderful kitties, as long as we're on the subject.
Yes.
God, wouldn't that be a fun class? So yeah, I feel like I've started down a couple of threads that I haven't come back to. So the first thing that I want to jump back to is, like, I was talking about the sort of cursing at women and calling them whores and sluts. What you actually find is that a lot of translators into English will tone those down for publication. Those particular types of things, like they'll call a hetaira a companion.
But isn't hetaira the technical definition is companion too? I mean, yes. I know that's not always the context,
it's an absolutely legitimate thing, but there's a lot of context that makes it very clear that what they mean is escort.
Yeah, okay. I just want to clarify that because I realized I had it in my head, because the reason that became interesting to me was that it's used for like Patroclus and Achilles, and I kind of love the difference between the use of like the masculine hetera. I don't know what the masculine form is, but and what we think of as
I think it's
hetera.
heteros. I think it's
that would make sense.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, I
but
interrupted
yeah,
that again, but I'm fascinated by all of it.
Hetera just means, you know, female companion, but when it's used in the context of like, I hired a hetera,
yeah,
it's very clearly meaning whore.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And the sex worker phobia that runs through a lot of translations, like just like the homophobia that runs through a lot of translations, is really palpable when you start comparing. So it's
Mm-hmm.
I haven't looked at the Greek for this one. I don't know whether Theodoridis or the other translator that you're looking at are more accurate here, but it might
Mm-hmm.
well actually be that Theodoridis is closer on that subject.
Mm-hmm.
Because
there are a lot. The word slut. I would love to know like the Greek contextualizing of like when we should use slut, because he uses that in like all these moments when the women are angry at Menesilicus, Euripides' father-in-law, and like yeah, that's where it really got me. Like I understand the use of the word whore as much as I would want to say sex worker. Like I understand it needs to be whore in these contexts, but like it's the overuse of the word slut, I guess, that I was just like, ah.
Yeah, I think the most common word you're going to see for that in the Greek is porne.
Oh wow, okay. Oh,
yeah,
that sounds right. All right,
I
can hear the etymology in there. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna look into the Greek before I cover the next episode, the final bit of this play, because I'm just fascinated.
But yeah, like there's a whole like categorization system for what kind of sex worker you're talking about. Like a hetera is like the highly paid courtesan type usually, but then you also get like the porne who's just like sort of a more generic. But then there's also, I can't remember the word right now, but there's something that means approximately like spring chicken for the street walking whores.
Love it.
So like there's a lot about sex work and sex workers, especially in comedy and iambics. You do find it mostly, we have more stuff later on, we have more stuff from Rome, but like it's there. And it gets alighted a lot when we talk about more modern translations, or I mean, heavens forbid, you know, like 1800s translations. Nobody wants to write those words out. Goodness, that would be inappropriate. It's like, yeah, because you're not translating the Bible, you're translating, you know, the Wife of Bath's tale, okay? So
yeah, I mean, the use of all of the women in this play, and like all of the stereotypes of their use of their sexuality, like both the more over the top and the some that were just like, oh, like the time I, you know, snuck out to meet up with my boyfriend, I told my husband I had a stomach ache or whatever, like I don't know, I found those very, very interesting, and I feel like I jumped topics there, sorry, but it just came to my mind.
No, that's fine. I'm all over the place too, because like I was thinking about also Melanippe. Like that's not a commonly told tale.
Yeah, what
Melanippe
is? Do you know it offhand?
Yeah, I went and looked it up again to make sure that I had this straight, because, like I said, it's not one that gets told a whole bunch. So Melanippe, was a princess, of course. She was raped by Poseidon. And she bore a pair of twins. She tried to conceal them, like conceal that she had been pregnant, by like just kind of sneakily leaving them as if someone had abandoned them, but then her father was going to kill them, so she admitted that she was their mother, and he went, well, I guess I can't slay my own kin, but let's expose the babies and send you away as a slave.
Lovely.
Right. So then what happens is that, of course, both babies get found. They're cared for by shepherds, and they come to be adopted by another queen who has been unable to bear children. I should really remember her name. I feel like it's Theone. But
I've certainly come across this myth, but I'm surprised it's not more familiar to me. I'm usually better than this.
Theano, that's why it is. That's what it is. It's Theano. So this other queen, whom Melanippe is now the slave of, ends up adopting Melanippe's sons unknowingly. But then later on, she bears twins of her own. And once all of them are grown, she's like, well, I don't want these sons I didn't actually give birth to become next in line for the throne. So she tells her own sons to kill Melanippe's sons, and that backfires, and Theano and both her sons are defeated. In some versions, Melanippe is the one who is, like, told to poison her own sons, and she decides to poison the other children instead. Even though it could get her killed. So like, this is the basic story and you can see where. So Euripides wrote 2 plays about Melanippe. We have some fragments of. I think the first is called Melanippe the Wise, and the second is called Melanippe Bound.
Fuck, I love Euripides.
Yeah, right? So the first one is about Melanippe giving birth to her twins and then saving them. And the second one is about Melanippe as a slave and the adoption and the death plot and that stuff. We think. Probably. So we can only guess at exactly what it is that Aristophanes is so darn angry about. But, given that story, it's very easy from a modern perspective to be like, Melanippe did nothing wrong. Like,
yeah,
what did she do? But, like, with all of the complaints in the play, you can kind of see this, well, she concealed her lover, even if it wasn't consensual. That's still a thing that they would get upset about. She concealed her pregnancy. She didn't let the babies get killed. So she's ruined, and she's protecting her babies that are, the cause of this ruination. And then as a slave, she's an unfaithful slave and a murderess. So, like, that's, like, I can see where, coming from the perspective of those sneaky women, want us to think that, they have good reasons for doing the things that they do, but they're really just sneaking around with wine sacks in their baby clothes. Like, you can kind of see how that happened, with a certain twisted and misogynist perspective.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, like, I can see where the argument gets made in cases like that, and, like, I'd be interested to know, whether any real woman took any kind of offense. But, like, I understand. What's interesting too is when there's this moments where they're, like, explicitly mad that Euripides is writing about people like Melanippe and Phaedra when he could be writing about Penelope, but he never writes about Penelope. And I found that very interesting because, it sounds like, without question, it was written by a man. It's one of the, it's like so much of the Penelope discourse of, like, this virtual, I like that. This virtuous woman who's, like, utterly perfect and like waited for her husband, all of that nonsense. Like, it's this, like, silly men's ideal of like what a woman should be. And so, yeah, it was particularly interesting to hear that comparison, because and it applies to so much of this play, where you're just like, it screams written by a man, and like I get it, it was, and it's the ancient world, and like we're not getting a lot written by not men, but it's fascinating to me.
More
and
than you
I
think,
think
but less than we talk about.
yeah. Yeah, not nothing, but I mean, certainly in these like, you know, theater contexts, we have men, and so but I think it's also has to do with me being so used to reading tragedy, and kind of always, not like I forget that comedy is going to be different, but I do forget how much at least Aristophanic comedy is like so based in real life that it becomes this, it really just is like an insight into the psyche of him and like the people around him in a way that I just, at the very least in this play, find very hard to wrap my head around.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's so hard to read Mnesilakos because that's clearly voicing what Aristophanes thinks, right?
Yeah.
Like, he goes on and on about the horrible things that women do, and all of the women are just kind of like, what the hell?
Yeah.
And that's my reaction too, but it's not the reaction that Aristophanes was trying to evoke, and it's probably not the one he got. He probably got men going, haha, yeah, women are terrible.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
like,
that's the thing too, like written by a man, performed by men, and viewed by probably almost only men. Like, certainly, I know a lot is said about whether there are any women in there, but there certainly are not. Like, the women who are meant to be at this festival, they are not watching this play.
and even if they were, I mean, think about it. Like, if you are on the side that Aristophanes is even plausibly correct there, that Mnesilakos is not just talking out his ass completely, which, a reminder, he is, even in context. If you are even slightly of that mindset, any protest that a woman makes is going to sound hollow in that context. Like, a woman saying, wow, that was a bunch of garbage, will be taken as, yeah, and I bet you carry a wine sack around swaddled in baby clothes too. Like, there's just there's no opening there for maybe women aren't trash.
Yeah. Oh god. Yeah. It's, oh my god. There's so much in this play. I also I want to hear your thoughts, and like I want to just kind of talk about it out loud, because is the thing that I've struggled with the most is also gender expression. Like, obviously the presentation of women in this play is wild and bananas, and oh my god. But also navigating the way Aristophanes portrays and views Agathon and Cleisthenes and Mnesilakos when he's dressed as a woman is like, there's just so much happening, and personally I've been really struggling trying to convey the narrative and explain the context without like even like, I mean, I feel like a lot of it, if you take it too seriously and you kind of forget a lot of the context around it, kind of sounds like, you know, like the nonsense that TERF spout, you know, this idea of like a man infiltrating a women's space and getting away with it. And like, I've just been struggling trying to convey how, like, that. I don't know. There's just so much there in 2023 that makes it like fucking difficult.
Yeah, certainly. Like, I don't think you're wrong calling it TERF like. Not so much in the man sneaking into a woman's space part, but because Mnesilicus isn't treated like a real threat.
Mm-hmm. True.
Right? Like, the women think he's a threat, but, like, we're supposed to sympathize with him. We're not supposed to sympathize with either Agathon or Cleisthenes.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is where it really comes in, right?
Yeah.
Because Agathon is, like, he's another tragedian who's a bit younger than Euripides, who is a frequent butt of Aristophanic ire. Aristophanes thinks that he is, he's too obsessed with aesthetics and that he's womanly. And, like, we really see that because we see Agathon completely dressed as a woman, and, Mnesilicus's reaction to seeing Agathon dressed as a woman is, that's not a woman, I know that, or that's not a man, I know that, whore, I think is what Euripides actually says there.
Well, there's one moment where it's like, oh, you don't recognize him, but you've probably had sex with him and you didn't even know it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay.
And that's in fact what Mnesilicus essentially says. What happened is, like, he knows Agathon as a woman, and I think in context, this is somebody we might suspect to be some manner of trans. Certainly Agathon, in the portrayals we have of him, which, again, we got to keep in mind this is through the lens of somebody who hates him, seems to be gender fluid. Seems to be perfectly capable of living life as both a man and a woman at different times. And that is a real thing. People are like that, and that's perfectly fine, and that may be something that helped in Agathon's writing, too. Like, that's sort of the context it's presented in here. So, what we may have is, somebody perfectly fine and respectable doing something that genuinely is an expression of their gender. Or what we may have is a whole lot of nothing piled on somebody that Aristophanes finds effeminate. Like, it's kind of hard to tell.
Yeah, that's the part that I found so fascinating, because the way Aristophanes portrays him, like, if you kind of ignore the fact that it's pretty obvious that Aristophanes is trying to insult him, like, that's pretty clear. But if you kind of ignore that context, Agathon's actually incredibly fun. Like, he is really open about being like, I don't care what my gender expression is. Like, I want to be all and everything. I want to utilize and have fun with these different, aspects. And he's
such a fabulous
amazing.
Queen.
Yeah,
like,
he seems like he would be
Race.
so much fucking fun to hang out with. Like, that's definitely a line that I have said in this, is like, if we take him at this version, if that is, in any kind of reference to his real lived experience, like, he sounds amazing and I want to be his friend, not least because he was written tragedy during it.
Yeah, and, like, look at his reaction. Look at his reaction to Mnesilicus needing to dress up, is like,
yeah, his reaction is like, I'm cool with it.
Okay, fine. If we're doing this, then here's a dress, and oh honey, you need this wig. Oh honey, you need these shoes.
Oh my god, not just a hairnet. No, you need this wig. Like, you're not gonna pull that off.
Like, excuse me. If we're doing this, we're doing it correctly.
Yeah.
And I find that so interesting. Like, it does speak to, at very least, a culture that has those things in it for people to recognize. Because so many people want to say, oh, like, trans people are this new phenomenon. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Without this portrayal, I could still tell you that there were plenty of ancient Greek trans people of various types. But, like, this portrayal relies on a cultural knowledge that this happens.
Yeah, that this is like a thing you can just comment on, that people are living like this. Not least because there are two characters, because Cleisthenes is also a little bit portrayed this way, like, differently. But, like, yeah, I mean, and between the two of them, that it's absolutely fascinating to have these kind of overt examples of, at the very least, some kind of gender fluidity just like openly among, you know, popular tragedian at this time.
And this is where it comes back around to that sort of gender critical crap, you know, because you know, the Queen of Turf Island herself has these awful, terrible trans characters, but when you read them you can be like, okay, like 1,000 years from now somebody might look at that and go like, you know, I can tell that she hates this person, but at the same time, like, here are things that we can acknowledge that must exist in that society to make it acceptable for somebody to do this, even if they're hated.
Yeah.
And really, this comes back to what I was saying about Aristophanes, just in general, that his viewpoint is very conservative, very right-wing, very oligarchic, and anti-democracy. And, like, he despises this breaking of the norms, breaking of the binary. He despises the women that he assumes are up to no good, because of course they're up to no good. He despises Euripides for trying to tell him that women are people.
Yeah.
With feelings and reasons, and that are
complex
not just
characters?
Obsessed with sex.
Ugh.
That even Phaedra is not just a sex-obsessed weirdo, you know?
Yeah.
It's really, it's the same bigotry in place then as now. And, you know, okay, Aristophanes wrote some great plays, but let me tell you, I'm not going to pay for his video game.
Yeah. Yep.
Like,
not gonna give him any money.
I wouldn't give him the time of day.
Yeah.
So when we come to Cleisthenes, there are a couple of really funny things going on.
Yeah.
Like, I mentioned briefly that there's some very tense political stuff happening in Athens at this time. The overthrow of democracy, the installation of an oligarchy. But there's also this subtle thing running through this play of, like, talking about the Persians. And there's a reason for that, which is that, like, the installation of the oligarchy was actually kind of funded by the Persians. Like, the Athenians had fought the Persians off 100 years ago or so. But at this point in the war, the Persians are funding both sides, both the Athenians and the Spartans, so that they'll fight each other.
That's wonderful.
And
I mean, it's just interesting. I suppose it should.
And Alcibiades, who was like the big Athenian general, has been exiled to Persia, where he is trying to get himself basically reinstalled in a position of power from. If you ever do a life of Alcibiades, I don't know if you've talked about him.
I mean,
oh my god.
Yeah, I would love to. I need, like, if I can find sourcing on things. So if you have anything to share my way, oh god, please do.
Oh my god, I love Alcibiades.
How could you not?
What little I've talked about,
like, oh my! I mean, just to remind the listeners of the favorite thing that we have to say about this man is that he was exiled ostensibly because he chipped off all the fucking dicks off all the herms in Athens, like. Probably didn't, and there's so much more to it, but that is the greatest story that that features him. It's just like going around in the dead of night and making sure no herm is left with a penis. It's just my favorite thing. But also his character in Assassin's Creed Odyssey.
I think the best part of that is the idea not just of him knocking the dicks off, but then stealing them.
Oh right, he keeps them. You gotta.
Like he's not just like removing the protective phalloid. He is taking all the dicks for himself. Which, you know, when Plato writes about him, that kind of makes sense. Apparently, he had the hots for Socrates in a bad way.
I mean, yeah, it's my favorite thing is the Assassin's Creed version of him where he will have sex with everyone in every city in all of Greece. Like, they just have so much fun with his character in that he pops up like almost everywhere that you travel, and you can romance him in every possible location, and he is just like half naked and hypersexualized in every single moment of that game.
That's pretty
and
much what we know about him. Yeah, that and his just
so
absolutely conniving with everybody so that he can maintain power.
Yeah, I mean,
and
seems
he
like a
he
real
ended up
gem.
living out his days actually as a governor of a province in Persia.
Sounds like a nice way to live.
Yeah. But at this point, like, the Women's Council in the Thesmophoria Zeusai, they call the council on two things. So it's not just that they want to kill Euripides. The other thing is that they want to kill anybody bringing in Persian influence.
Right, yeah. And
you
tyranny
can tell,
specifically.
and you can tell that Aristophanes, for all his like Athenian pride shit, is making fun of them for this.
Mm-hmm.
Which just lines up perfectly with his support of the oligarchy that the Persians are trying to help install. Like, it all lines up. And if you look at the undercurrent of like when the Persians or the Corinthians are mentioned, like, you can see Aristophanes' personal politics coming into play all throughout this. And so Cleisthenes, to bring it back around to our other crossdresser, Cleisthenes is a sort of ambassador who is working with the Persians, and he's tattling to the women. He's ineffectual. He's effeminate. He's inexperienced. And, he's openly admitting to being a man in a dress. To go back to the gender critical ideology there.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he's out there saying, look at me, I'm a trans woman, and a trans woman is a man in a dress, because that's me. And it's like, wow, that's a thing that you just did there, Aristophanes. The idea is that he's a man betraying his own sex.
Mm-hmm.
And an emissary betraying his own city.
Right, yeah. Yeah. That's very interesting. I'm curious because having looked at the two translations, I wondered about how explicit it was that Cleisthenes is meant to be actually dressed like a woman. Like, in the Theodorides, he definitely postulates that he is. In the Halliwell, it's less obvious. It's more so that he's like kind of saying like, I'm one of you women, but at the same time they do like immediately call him a boy, obviously in both translations, because he's clean shaven. But it was just interesting to me, the idea that like, was he definitely dressing as a woman, like definitely trying to portray himself as one, or was he coming at it more like, I'm with you, I'm a fan, I align myself with women? And I was curious about that.
I actually think this has to come back to sort of the sex work angle. Sex work might be too generous here, because the category of young boys who were seen as sex object is really coming into play here, I think. I mean, this is my personal opinion. You'll find people who differ on this. I don't know whether he would explicitly wear a dress in this scene, but I think what they're talking about when they're like, you're a boy, you're clean shaven, you're beautiful and youthful. I think what they're getting at is that he is like them in that he is a sex object.
Yeah, it's like the pederasty of it all, right? Like the, I mean, it comes back, especially with Agathon. It comes to the nature of gay relationships, obviously between men only in ancient Athens, where it's like, it's more respectable if you're the top. If you're the bottom, you're basically a woman. And it feels like that's kind of what he's doing with both of those characters.
Right. And that difference between the penetrator and the one being penetrated is a big distinction for them, much more so than your actual gender identity. And so I think that regardless of whether you take Cleisthenes to actually be wearing a dress, like, I think that's less important than the implication that he is in the same category as a woman.
Yeah, okay. No, that makes sense.
But the fact that he feels such kinship with them is really interesting. And the fact that Aristophanes doesn't go the next step and have Euripides dress as a woman, and Euripides be the one who is associated with women, is actually kind of interesting to me. Because I would have expected it here, right? Like, the whole point of this is that he's revealing women's secrets. Ooh, how we hide our boyfriends from our fathers. Yeah, right. But like, that's the idea, and so you'd think that would be a prime opportunity to have Euripides, not Nasilicus, cross-dress and play the part of the woman. But when Agathon suggests it, Euripides won't do it. Like,
yeah, he says he's like going to be too recognizable or something, right? He's like, I can't pass. But it's interesting that he's like, my father-in-law can pass. Like,
right.
Yeah.
He says, I'm too old and I have too big a beard and I have too recognizable a face. And it's like, well, but do you if you shave off the beard?
Yeah, like if this father-in-law of yours, you can shave off his beard, and like I recognize he wouldn't be Euripides, but like it seems to be that as soon as that happens, this man like completely looks like he's a woman, and you know, they all the women in there have no problem believing it.
Right. And so I wonder at that. I feel like it has some importance. My thoughts on that line are kind of, I wonder if the point of calling out an older, respected playwright, if there was a line that was too far to cross.
Right.
Because you know, that's not always the case. Like, in The Clouds, Aristophanes lambasts Socrates pretty much by name. Like, that's the whole point of The Clouds.
Well, and in The Frogs, he gets at Euripides pretty hard in that one too.
Yeah, but again, like, that's a contest between the words Euripides wrote and the words Aeschylus wrote at that point. And so he has some plausible deniability.
Right.
So, like, so I feel like there's got to be some other reason underlying this, and I wonder if there was some reputation of Euripides as very masculine that would have made that joke hard to pass off.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've also heard the theory that that like maybe Aristophanes didn't just hate Euripides like it seems, but actually they were like best bros, and he's making fun of him in a more friendly kind of way. I don't totally know how I feel about that, because I feel like Euripides deserves better. Yeah, okay.
I don't believe it for a second. Like
No,
I can't make that work in my head.
I mean, the more I read of Aristophanes, and even just the more you've said here too, like I agree. Mostly, I think because I just think Euripides is so much better than that. But that might be like, you know, my own.
Like, I'm also
through.
just thinking about Euripides' writing and the politics that he displays.
Yeah.
Euripides had a fondness for pushing the envelope and trying to widen people's minds, and that's the total opposite of what Aristophanes likes to do.
Yeah.
You know, Aristophanes is always on about how every time you do that, you let in more nonsense. If you let the women rule, then, you know, everything will be topsy-turvy and nothing will make sense. If you If you're acting no better than women, then we might as well stop fighting at all. If you take litigiousness to its extreme, this is the birds I'm talking about here. If you take litigiousness to its extreme, then you could litigate the crown off of Zeus. Which is the actual ending of the birds.
Amazing.
So like anytime that you let new thoughts in, anytime that you have somebody corrupting the youths, as they accuse Socrates of doing, that they could think for themselves, that they should question things, that things don't have to stay the way they were, that Aristophanes responds by lampooning it, by making it seem like you're just wanting change for change's sake and there's no actual reason to do that, things are fine the way they are. It's a very conservative mindset. And Euripides is basically the exact opposite. It's like, women have feelings. It's worth considering that what they do in bearing children in his Medea is just as dangerous as standing behind a spear in battle. It's worth considering that, marrying women off against their will is not always going to end up well. It's worth considering that there is more to the world than just what we have in front of us, and that if what I have to do is stage the Furies in a tragedy to get you to listen, that's what I'll do. Which reportedly made people run out of the stadium in terror, by the way.
Which moment is that exactly?
Oh, I'm trying to remember, but that's in the play about Orestes.
It's just Orestes.
Yeah, the Furies come on to chase him, and staging the Furies was such a taboo that people literally ran from the theater, reportedly.
I love Euripides.
I know, right? So like, I cannot imagine people with such disparate views of the world sitting down and being bros.
Yeah.
When it's not that can never happen, but the cognitive dissonance you have to hold to do it is pretty hard.
Yeah. It's like today, right? Like, this came up yesterday. Somebody messaged me to tell me that they really enjoyed the show, really loved the content, but they actually had to stop listening because I said Jordan Peterson and everyone who associates him with are fucking garbage people. And I just think, that it reminds me of that, where I'm like, I will never be able to be friends with someone who, comes at me telling me that Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan are like the salt of the earth. And I think, okay, yeah, like that's just the line that gets drawn. So yeah, I think there's lots of modern references like that.
Yeah, like I totally agree, for the record.
Yeah. Good, that's why you're on the show.
Jordan Peterson is like the epitome of the mediocre white man who got by on bullshitting until he found himself in the spotlight.
That is like almost exactly a tweet I tweeted yesterday.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't see that one.
Exactly.
But yeah.
No. Like I just mean I agree with you completely. Yeah.
It's been, there is a certain mindset for which that kind of jargony talking in circles is very appealing, because it sounds like you have all the answers. And they feel like they have none of the answers. And they're like, yes, pour your wisdom into me, and I will ignore all the cognitive dissonance that implies.
Yeah.
And it's very culty, honestly.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, like it's a very cultish thing, and I think that we as a society need to do better with our teaching of critical thinking, particularly, and with our support, so that people don't feel so helpless all the time.
Yeah, agree entirely. Yeah,
but this is very
agree entirely, and yeah, I know exactly. I was gonna say I agree completely, and also let's talk more about. I want to say Aristophanes, but mostly I mean Euripides, because that's what I really want to talk about. But yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. That no, I agree. You know that the likelihood of them being friends seems not likely at all. But I mean, it is so. I don't even know where I was going with that, but I suppose it is just interesting how much he does come at Euripides, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on those moments. So I haven't written the episode on this bit yet, but basically like after Cleisthenes comes and goes, and then they just kind of start like just acting out the Helen and the Andromeda and another one, I think. And like it's as if they're just, especially with the Helen, it's like Euripides comes on stage, he's playing Menelaus, and they just like act out a huge portion of the Helen. And it felt so bizarre to me. And like I don't, I read the Helen like I don't know, 8 months ago now, so I'm not going to remember like exactly what the line comparison is, but it felt to me that that's what it is. And I just sort of am curious like what Aristophanes is doing. Like I guess he's insulting the Helen, which I fucking love that play.
It's such a good play.
But yeah, it's such a good play. It's so good.
Yeah, so the Helen is one of those moments, especially the beginning, and that is I don't know if it's a direct quotation or a paraphrase of the opening scene of the Helen, but it is the opening scene of the Helen, where Helen is claiming sanctuary at a tomb to, keep herself free of marrying this guy, and Menelaus washes up on shore, and they have this sort of weird reunion. But the thing is that Euripides is playing with the myth in an interesting way. Not necessarily of Helen being in Egypt, because that existed before. That goes that variation goes back at least to Stesichorus, where you have like the cloud Helen, essentially.
Eidolon,
which again, lovely.
It's the best. Yeah, I did a whole series on it last year. It's one of my favorite things.
So like you have first of all, you have virtuous Helen, which is gonna piss off Aristophanes to no end just for being virtuous Helen.
Yeah,
right?
True.
Because the oligarchs, especially the conservatives, especially love to hate Helen. Love to show her off as the epitome of what every woman does wrong and why women are cursed. She's practically Eve, right? So to have it start with virtuous Helen, and then to take Menelaus, one of the heroes, and have him be kind of a bumbling comedic idiot in a tragedy.
Yeah, it's so interesting because these are the things that I talked about and obsessed over when I was talking about the tragedy itself last year, and then now I was thinking about it in Aristophanes, and I was like, well, he's just quoting it. But you're right, like he's quoting this one so intentionally, and meanwhile, it leaves us to go, this is a play that makes Euripides like the fucking realist, like he's just so good. And meanwhile, of course, it's exactly the play that makes Aristophanes go, this guy, like, he likes women.
Right. So this is an exact parallel to what Aristophanes is doing with his women in Thesmophoria, right? Because the woman is in charge, so to speak, and the man is a bumbling buffoon. And so, like, with Aristophanes sort of saying, like, right now our women are in charge, and because the men are acting like women, acting no better than women. And here he has, and look, Euripides is reinforcing that by having this woman who is virtuous and who knows what's going on, and this great Greek hero who is, tumbling ass over fist and doesn't know his head from his stomach, right? So, and that in a tragedy that's supposed to be serious. So putting that in this context reframes it as this Euripides is so bad at tragedy that he's writing comedy. And Euripides is so bad for the city with his politics of pushing the envelope that he's acting no better than a woman.
Yeah.
So like that's my personal read on it. You might find others. Now, the Andromeda I don't know as much about.
Yeah, well, it's fragmentary, so it's harder
Right.
for us. I feel like this has got to be like I mean, probably it's one of our reference points. I haven't looked into the Andromeda too much. I did have a guest
Right.
on during the Helen, because Toff Marshall, C.W. Marshall,
Oh,
he
wonderful.
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And yeah, and so he studied the Helen and then the fragmentary Euripides. So we talked a little bit about like the Andromeda then, but it is interesting because it is fragmentary, so we don't really know entirely what he's playing on or what the play contained. I mean, obviously it had the Perseus myth, but it's fascinated me generally that he did write the Andromeda and in the same year as the Helen, because and that he's like, I mean, I guess just having these plays that are so focused on the women alongside more famous men, and I wouldn't say necessarily that Helen is not, is less famous than Menelaus, but certainly Andromeda and Perseus, like you would think that the tragedian would be writing a play called Perseus, not Andromeda, and so that kind of in itself is fascinating. And then obviously, just even the woman centered notion of these plays is what Aristophanes is picking up on. Like, oh my God, he went to year and he wrote all these plays about women, and then it's almost like the next year that's exactly what Aristophanes did. He's like, but I'm going to be insulting women rather than making them interesting like Euripides.
Yeah, and it does make me wonder a little about the context of the Andromeda. I wonder if in that as well we have an Andromeda who is pure and virtuous shown against a Perseus who is prideful and hubristic, which
Mm-hmm.
is not a hard read of the myth, right? Like
No, it's pretty true to the myth.
not, but like when you frame the story that way, especially up against something like the Helen, this sort of theme of virtuous women captives struggling to find some semblance of normalcy while the men blunder about and make fools of themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and muck everything up. That's a very Euripidean take, right? Like that's a very sort of like, well, think about this is the year before when they exiled Alcibiades again, when they decided to send the Sicilian expedition and everything started to go haywire, and like the context of this is like it's not hard to read that the next step as our bad military decisions are making Athens suffer, right? And if you put that up against, of course, Aristophanes, like, well, yeah, your bad decisions, not mine. Like, like, that's because you're too lenient. It's definitely not because of our policy of conquest. Like, it reads very politically to me. Like, I don't think any of that's an accident.
Mm-hmm.
There's this line in the Euripides translation that has been, bouncing around my head. It's one of the cruder jokes when I mean, because there's so many jokes that involve Nasilochus's giant comic phallus, right? And when the women sort of lift his dress and find it, and there's this like, ooh, there it is. Oh, it's gone again. Ooh, there it is. And they say, your phallus is coming and going like the Corinthians out of our isthmus.
Yeah.
And so that is very directly Aristophanes saying that the Corinthian navy is fucking us. We are being penetrated by these Corinthian ships, and we should fight back against it. And it's just such a very political wartime reference that it's like it feels almost out of place here, and it kind of jars you back to that mindset of like, oh wait, Aristophanes is being a war hawk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, it's so interesting. I'm glad to hear all this like political additions to the whole narrative, because as much as I've been reading a bunch of, I mean, it's interesting because this play is not one that's written about a lot when you're reading on Aristophanes. So I've been like reading a couple different books and like, you know, just kind of skimming through a bunch of different sections on Aristophanes the person, and Thesmophoria has to be like one of the least referenced plays in the sources I've been looking at. So I've been like learning a lot about him and his staging and all this, but yeah,
it's amazing to me how little has been written about this one when there's such clear political driving forces.
Yeah, and there are very few translations too. Like there's not a lot broadly on this play at all.
Yeah, I was kind of looking around to see what commentaries were out there, and there really are not very many. There really just aren't. I mean, like there are articles for sure. Like it's not completely neglected, but like there's really only one translation and commentary that I found, and that was, you know, in the last 10 years, I think. And I was just like, huh. You know, like I never read the Thesmophoria until pretty far into my career as an academic. But I thought that was just because I wasn't focusing on comedy.
Right.
But no, like it really is understudied. And I wonder if part of that is because it's so hard to translate the context.
Yeah. I mean, I understand, like, I mean, I understand, I've seen people talking about it too, but I understand that Aristophanes broadly would be very difficult to translate. Like, I mean, especially like, you know, you get into, I think the Scythian is probably a really good example of this too, but he also wrote a lot of people in like weird dialects that like, then you have to try to convey that. Like, I know the Spartan woman in Lysistrata is an example of that. And I would imagine the Scythian, because I read the end half in the Halliwell just because it was easier to make sure I read the whole thing before talking to you. But the translation of the Scythian speech in that is like very odd and interesting, and like you can tell they're trying to make some kind of, I mean, there's a play as if like obviously Greek is not this person's first language, but it's interesting. And I imagine there's like a lot of that in Aristophanes, and trying to translate that would be like, oh my god, you know.
Yeah, political context is so important for Aristophanes in particular. Like it's important for most things, but like with most other comedians, comic playwrights that we have even fragments of, the more common style of comedy is very, it's what turned into commedia dell'arte. It's very stock. It's got a few characters that like you can always recognize, and like it's very like mythologically based, so you can recognize that trajectory. But with people doing political satire like Aristophanes, you really have to know what they're satirizing in order to make any sense of it, and sometimes we just don't. It's like if somebody tried to, you know, play SNL sketches to aliens 2,000 years in the future without telling them anything about modern American politics, it wouldn't make any sense.
That's so
you know,
true.
they get the sense of who Donald Trump is and who Hillary Clinton is or whatever, but like they wouldn't actually know what had happened in the news. And that's the kind of thing we're working with here. Like, you know, I spoke very like confidently about Cleisthenes. Like, we know he was essentially an ambassador, an official emissary. I speculate that he was working with Persia because that's what makes sense in context. And there are probably historians who study this period as like their focus that know a lot more about him than I do. But like, without knowing who Cleisthenes is, it's like, oh, just some guy in a dress. Okay.
Well, yeah, even the Agathon too. Like, I mean, you know, for my purposes, I've had to go into a lot of detail about, like, I don't have the whole history background, but I've just done some like Googling of these people, because it's vital that I explain who Agathon is, because like we don't have his tragedies. So he's just a name, and without the context of knowing that he is not an invented character, he is a real person. Like, the play itself is so different without that knowledge. It's like, yeah, I mean, if you're reading this play and you don't know who Agathon is, maybe you don't even know who Euripides is. Like, I can't really see that happening, but like, it's not impossible,
Right.
And so, like, if somebody who doesn't have any background in any kind of classics picks this up and they don't even know who Euripides is, like, what a baffling thing to read, let alone the fact that there is all this historical and political context that is, needed on top of the fact that this is a play explicitly about a very real person who wrote tragedies. It's I often forget how different it is, because I have not covered many comedies because they're not really my favorites. But I often forget how different it is to tragedies, because tragedies primarily are focused on mythological characters. And while there is like political context that's often under the surface, like, it is not as obvious and in your face as Aristophanes, where he is almost always writing about real people from his time who did real things. And you need so much more knowledge to understand like everything in the play, other than like the very dick jokes. Those are universal and timeless, and there are so many in this play.
There are so many.
There's too many.
Yeah. I'm not a big fan of comedy either, honestly. I find it more interesting as a source than as as an artifact in and of itself. Primarily because, the sense of humor of the comedians we have left is so very conservative and sexist and gross to me. Like, it feels like I'm falling back on my catchphrase of "I'm too ace for this shit." I don't enjoy dick jokes most of the time. I don't enjoy how crass everybody is in these things.
Yeah.
So I'm much more interested in, in what it says about what's going on at the time. Which for me makes Aristophanes actually kind of fascinating. But for anybody coming at this as just a play, it's like, but who the hell is that?
Yeah. I mean, I agree completely. Like, starting to cover this, I was just like, oh my god, the volume of dick jokes, like, in this play that is about a women's only festival. And like, I'm tired of it. Like, it's quite excessive. I really, I've said this on the episodes already, but I regret starting this play. I do. I think it's probably good in the end that people will know it, and great, and I get to defend Euripides, but like, this is not the favorite thing that I've ever done. Frogs was so different because it is so silly and there are singing frogs, and there are fewer dick jokes because the silly is the singing frogs, but this one is just, it's just all dick jokes. What, like, I mean, yeah, it's quite a play.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that it is set at a women's festival. Like, that the Thesmophoria existed is something that I think is a little bit hard to conceptualize for people now.
Yeah, I went into it in the beginning. Well, the episode will air tomorrow. Obviously will have aired by the time this one airs, but I spent like the first half of the episode talking about what we know of the Thesmophoria, which is like a decent amount, which was so exciting. Because that's why I covered this play, because I was like, oh my god, there's a women's only festival, and also Euripides is in this play. Like, obviously I should cover it. And then I'm reading it and I'm like, right, but I just forgot the Aristophanes part. Like, I just kind of neglected to think about the fact that, sure, this is about a women's only festival and Euripides features, and even though I knew it was a Euripides slander, I still just failed to think of, right, this is Aristophanes.
It's really fascinating to think about these women's festivals in the context of the men who wrote about them. Because like, this is not our only example. We have I think there's a passage in Thucydides even that is about the women off celebrating the Atenea at the same time the men are holding like a council, and like the sound is interrupting the council. And I'm going to be really upset at myself if I misremembered who that passage is from, because it sounds like it should be in Herodotus. But I think it was in Athens, so it wouldn't be. But also we have, like, if you look at the Bacchae, to bring in another...
Always happy to look at the Bacchae.
another Euripides. So that whole play is about a man who is obsessed with and upset by the women having a festival without the men outside the city walls, and how it kills him.
They're too cool for him, that's all.
Like,
yeah, that's so true.
Now I want to look up when the Bacchae was written, because now I wonder if it was a response to this play.
It's not impossible, but I don't think so, because it was at least performed posthumously, and I think Euripides had another chunk of years after this that he was writing. Not to say that he didn't write it and just not perform it, but I know it was at least performed after he died. But that is an interesting question too, because it does kind of feel like it could be like, well, I can write about women going to a festival too, and it's just going to be a hell of a lot gorier
and more fun.
So much
and
more
fun. Realistic. Like,
yep.
You know, because in that play you have the main character, whose name is escaping me at the moment.
Pentheus.
Yeah, Pentheus is sitting in his city, like, imagining all of the nasty things the women must be up to, when really they're just out there dancing in the fields. And like, it doesn't get nasty until he shows up to interrupt them.
Yeah.
And everybody tries to tell him this, and he just refuses to believe it. And like, that just feels so much to me like, Aristophanes, calm your shit down.
Yeah, that's so true. I like that comparison of, I mean, just all of it, and I could think about the Bacchae forever, but it is so uniquely different ways of handling, you know, a festival that at the very least in Bacchae is almost all women, aside from, you know, the god, but yeah, and the Pentheus of it all. But oh my gosh, I don't know, my brain kind of went off. We had a weird,
but yeah, I mean,
there,
like we started talking about like gender presentation and gender expectation, and I think the Bacchae is a really good counterpoint here. Because in that play, somebody who is far too rigid to the point of his own death, is clearly like fascinated by the gender play, but afraid of it, afraid that it will destroy him, and in the end it does, because he's too rigid. And the god themselves is very much presented in a gender fluid way in that play. And not without reason. Like, this is Dionysus we're talking, the breaker of norms, the destroyer of binaries. That's what Dionysus does. That's why he is the god of drama and of wine and of the wild places where rules don't apply. That's set up against in Thesmophoria, where the gender binary is incredibly strict, and people who break it are to be mocked and burnt and shot with arrows. And the people on the other side of the line, the women, are necessarily evil, right? They're necessarily as sex crazed and deceptive as everybody wants to think they are. They're this other, this unknowable and suspicious other, rather than exactly what they seem, other human beings doing things their own way. And I think that really is very telling about that difference I see between Aristophanes' approach to gender and to politics, and Euripides' approach to gender and politics.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of how perfect Bacchae is as a counter to this. But it is both a perfect counter, and it is just like, I mean, for so many reasons, but like, you know, a great example of why Euripides is not only, just the best, and I love him, but like also just a fascinating person, and especially like certainly this play was written after. So whether it was, whether he had it in mind or not, that he was writing Bacchae to counter Thesmophoria, like I think that the idea is certainly there. Like he would have known, and while even if it was like 5 or 10 years later, he could have just been still thinking about, all the nonsense that Aristophanes put into this play, and all the ways that he, very rigidly and very critically played with gender. And then I almost called Euripides Dionysus. That works, honestly. And then, Euripides was like, well, if you're going to do that, and in my name, no less, then I'm going to write this play where we have this character who is fascinated by gender fluidity, and his conservative nature is actually his downfall, even when he does play with gender. Like he lets himself play with it and it blows up, and he is, this conservative character who is too rigid and too many things. I'm very into the idea of Bacchae now in connection to this.
But yeah, in general, ancient comedy is a little bit too crude for me. I've never really gotten into iambics or into comedy for its own sake. But I think it's also pretty telling that, the funniest joke that Aristophanes ever told is the same joke the Babylon Bee tells every 3 weeks.
What is this?
Pronouns!
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah. Like it's pretty telling that Aristophanes' idea of the funny thing that you can say about gender is, ha ha, look at the man in a dress.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that this is still somehow compelling to so many people. I think it speaks to my personal mantra when it comes to humanity, is that people as a whole never really change. We have the same flaws, the same foibles and weaknesses as people 1,000, 2,000 years ago did, but we also have the same greatness that they did.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks very well of people who are more open-minded that Euripides is still so popular, and Aristophanes is just making the same tired joke as all of the TERFs.
Yeah.
They never came up with anything new in 2,000 years of history.
And it's, at the very least, I do think, as much as I want to joke about singing frogs, but I do think at the least, like, Aristophanes is known for something like the frogs in comparison to Thesmophoria. Obviously, Lysistrata he's certainly well known for that. But I think that the most commonly talked about tends to be the frogs, and I think it might even just be because enough people today would much rather see a joke about singing frogs than have to rehash the very tired and now deeply offensive, certainly it was offensive always, but enough people realize it now, idea that like comedy is a man dressing as a woman, ha ha ha, so it's vaguely reassuring.
Yep. Honestly, I'm surprised The Birds isn't more popular, because the way that Americans latch on to people being over litigious it's so relatable. But yeah, I think as fascinating as I find the Thesmophoria Zeusai, I'm glad that it's Cicely's popular comedy.
Agreed.
I think
now that I know
that
it
speaks really well of humanity.
Yep. Agree entirely. Well, this has been so much fun, and also insightful, and so many things, because it's Aristophanes, but at least we're defending Euripides because if we had just spent this hour and a half having to only look at Aristophanes, it would have been far less enjoyable. So I'm glad I had you on in my defense of Euripides. Thank you.
This has been a real pleasure. Like I said, anytime. I love doing this. So we must stand for Euripides.
Oh, always.
And those Aristophanic conservatives need to learn that there's more to life than their narrow scope.
Absolutely. Well said. Well, is there, for one, I will absolutely be jotting down your name for Hippolytus, so thank you.
Sweet.
But do you want to tell my listeners where to find more from you, if you want them to follow you, read more, what have you?
Yeah, well, first of all, most importantly, you can find me on a previous episode of this podcast.
Damn right.
Not just a phase, where we talk about asexuality in Greek mythology. And you can also find me on both Twitter and Mastodon at Brododactylos. That's BRODODAKTYLOS.
And it will be linked in the episode's description in case you didn't type that out.
Which is perfectly reasonable. I'll tell you right now that it's Aeolic dialect, which is Sapphic for rosy-fingered, which is an epithet for the dawn.
Oh, I'm so glad you told me that. Yes. Oh my god, I love that. I've noted your handle for so long, and also Rosy Fingered Dawn is one of my all-time favorite things. So, and God Sapphic and Aeolic.
Those are probably the best places to follow me. You can also find my work on such blogs as Paizomen, where I talk about the mechanics of antiquity in video games. And I also have a relatively new post about the gods of the Forgotten City. And you can find me talking academia on Ancient Office Hours with the Ozymandias Project.
Thank you. Oh my gosh, so much fun. Phew, nerds. That conversation, honestly, it helped so much. It helped me so much, so I hope it helped you all too. And as you heard, I went into this thinking I absolutely just hated the play, and while I don't entirely feel differently now, I at least feel like I understand it and can appreciate more things about it. The historical and political context helps immensely. That's one of those things that, as much as I generally know the culture of ancient Greece at the time, the specific time periods and really intricate political machinations that go on in those little time periods are not something that I know offhand or have the bandwidth to research for every episode of this show. So thank the gods for amazing, nerdy academics who want to come on and both explain history and politics and also espouse the wonders of Euripides. He deserves the world. So make sure you follow Julie on Twitter and beyond. Take in their work whenever you can find it. I'm fairly certain you're going to hear her on the podcast again because gods know I want to cover Hippolytus in more detail now. More Euripides is always a good thing. Next week, we have the final narrative episode of this play. But also, fortunately, another scholar came on the show and who knows even more about Aristophanes as a person, and I think that'll make even more of a difference in understanding this play and appreciating it beyond my attempts to make it a narrative structure. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympians and handles so many podcast-related things, but I'm so glad for her that she did not have to read the Thesmophoria Zeusi. Stephanie Foley works to transcribe the podcast for YouTube captions and accessibility. The podcast is hosted and monetized by iHeartMedia. Help me continue bringing you the world of Greek mythology and the ancient Mediterranean by becoming a patron, where you'll get bonus episodes and more. Visit patreon.com/mythsbaby or click the link in this episode's description. Thank you all for listening, nerds. You are the best. Gods, I love conversation episodes. They are so damned insightful and can really change the trajectory of the series. Particularly this one. Thank fuck. I am Liv, and I love this shit. But not Aristophanes. He was a douchebag.